Bienvenue au webinaire organisé par I.S.Rivers et en partenariat avec ECRR et Rewilding TV. Aujourd'hui, nous allons parler d'un thème qui est la revitalisation des rivières avec les solutions fondées sur la nature. Et ben Anne, je te passe la main pour que tu te
Oui.
présentes.
Bonjour, moi je suis Anne Clément et au nom du GREI et de la ZAB, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à ce second webinaire I.S.Rivers. Au démarrage, quelques consignes. Tac. Quelques règles.
So a few rules for this webinar, which has simultaneous translation, which is recorded in its French and English versions. So please don't forget to change your names when you come onto the webinar. Put your name and your first name and your establishment. The participants, please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. If you have any questions to ask, please write them in the chat. For simultaneous translation, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a planet with interpretation, and you can choose French if you want to listen in French, and English if you wish to listen to the seminar in English. So that's it for us, and we can start. So today, we have a lot of people signed up, more than 430 people, and half between France and international countries, so quite a few practitioners, 62%, and a lot of researchers as well for the rest. So you can see in the pie chart the detail of who is listening us today. What's interesting is that we've managed to have people from throughout the world, the American continent, Africa, and Europe. As I was saying, this webinar is organized in collaboration with 3 platforms, the Réseau Rivière, ICRR, and the GREI. The Réseau Rivière is a national network for the restoration of rivers in France, and we will look at their webpage afterwards. The ICRR is the European network for the restoration of rivers in Europe, and I will let Anne introduce the GREI. The GREI is a regional association with a national and international vocation also, and which organizes research and commits to promote the valorization of researcher programs interacting with players in the field. So a lot of you are familiar with the GREI. It's an international organization. So regarding the Réseau Rivière Rivers Network, this is a screenshot of its website. So there are a lot of webinars organized by them, and it's a very active network in France and working with researchers and operators in the field. And they also work with elected representatives. And that is a very important point for the transfer of knowledge. So the ICRR website, and this is the European Network for Restoration of Rivers. And for the French representatives, it's the National Center for Rivers. And this is a very significant network working on the restoration of rivers and with a lot of events organized by the network. So the GREI, as I was saying, is an association whose vocation is to organize research with players in the field and to transfer the results of research as fast as possible to operators in the field. And in particular, every 3 years with the ZAB, we organize conferences that are rather atypical because they bring together researchers, operators around research action in the service of rivers. We organize these conferences every 3 years. The last one took place in 2022, and our partners and ourselves as organizers decided in between these sessions to hold webinars to bring together the community of participants in I.S.River. And this year, we're happy to organize 3 webinars, of which this one in partnership with Rivière-TB, and which brings together our different participants. So the partners of the I.S.Rivers and of this rivers, you can see on the screen, we have technical and financial partners at the level of the Rhone catchment area. We can't quote them all, but this, we benefit from ERDF funds, and we have many international associations and French associations as well, and we would like to thank them warmly for their support. So, today we have 3 guests. Dr. George Heritage, who's going to be talking to us about the zero stage, which is an American concept which is developing in Europe. Then we will have Dean Morrison talking about leaky dams. It's a concept which we don't use a lot in France, but it is used a lot in the UK. And then we will have Stephen Bennett, who will be talking to us about beaver-type dams. So before we pass the floor to the first speaker, can we make sure that George has managed to join us? So I'm afraid George is having trouble joining us. So we will actually begin with the second speaker, who is Dean Morrison. If we can get him to connect, well, then he will have to come last. So now I'm going to move on to the English channel so I can read the questions, and I pass the floor to Dean Morrison. Thank you.
Et donc, chaque intervenant a 20 minutes d'intervention.
So each speaker will give their presentation, and then we will have 10 minutes of questions and answers. So
Dean,
please ask your questions in the chat.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Dean Morrison. I'm not Dr. Dean Morrison. I'm a practitioner in natural flood management in the UK. And so I have to translate some of the ideas about using leaky woody dams and things like that for flood management into practice in our landscapes.
Please share your screen.
I'll share my screen now. Okay.
It's okay.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Great. So I work for a kind of a regional park, natural protected area in the southeast of England, and I'm working on a couple of projects there. But I have been involved across the UK and internationally doing some of this work. Let's go to the next slide. So just a little bit of background about the UK, first of all. We are famous for our rain, so we do get rather a lot of that on the Atlantic coast. But we're also a very densely populated country. So there are lots of inhabitations that have been built in areas that are now flood prone. And with factors like climate change, the damage that causes and will potentially cause in the future is very large economically. This has been exacerbated over time by changes to land management and industrialization of the landscape, which has been very much designed to get rid of water as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, for agricultural purposes and others. And this adds to the problems. So in a sense, what we're trying to do is to reverse that process. So there's been a lot of interest in the UK over the last 15, 20 years in working with landscapes to use them to mitigate flooding. And not just in the UK. I mean, previously I worked with the Southeast Rivers Trust, who are part of a European project looking at flooding with partners in Germany, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And we were looking kind of in a holistic way at flooding, because there is no one solution. It's a problem that needs to be tackled at many layers, starting from kind of not building houses in floodplains in the first place would be quite a good one, but looking right through to what happens when people do get flooded and recovery afterwards. But the bit we're interested in is to try and mitigate floods when they happen, so they're less serious through adapting the landscape. In some of the
Dean, sorry, from the translator, could you possibly get closer to your microphone? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll try and speak up. Is that better?
Yes,
yeah.
Actually, yes.
Yeah, okay. So to use a bit of jargon, we use a term in the UK called working with natural processes. And there's a major document which provides the evidence on that. And in particular, what we're trying to do is to help communities which cannot be helped by traditional flood management techniques like building flood walls or major engineering approaches. So very often these are small communities which are high up in the headwaters of catchments, where it's too costly to, or just impossible to put in big engineering solutions. So in which case, very often the communities themselves have identified the opportunity to work with the landscape to make it more absorbent and to slow down flows of water. It's still in its infancy, this work. We've done lots of pilot projects. We're still trying to understand when and where and how to do it. But it is an approach which is now backed by our government. I've provided links to all of these documents at the end of this presentation. I'll put them in the chat. But this was a major piece of work looking at all of the approaches we could use to make the landscape more absorbent and hold water. They're perhaps summarized in this diagram, which I'm sure many of you've seen, looking at flooding and water all the way from the headwaters down to the sea. And if you can see my arrow, what we're looking at probably are leaky barriers right up in the headwaters. But there are approaches that can be taken all the way down to coastal realignment. And when we look at techniques, there are very many of them. Now, I'm involved in all of these in some ways. So leaky woody dams is just one of the approaches we take, or leaky barriers. But they're a very, very commonly used one in my part of the world. But there are other things. I work with colleagues looking at farm systems which maintain grassland and good, healthy grassland and help develop soil health. Very often we have impermeable clay soils. So if we can improve grassland cover and richer, deeper soils, that should help. Other examples, here's an example of a English bluebell woodland. And you can see on the right-hand side, the woodland floor has been destroyed by grazing animals, by sheep, which not only kind of makes the surface impermeable and more prone to flooding, it also means lots of sediments are carried with that water. So that can cause problems downstream. And simply by fencing this ancient woodland, that's the same place a year and a half later, or 2 years later, actually. And then there are other approaches which are kind of building variable storage ponds. So there's a pipe in that pond you can see on the left. And so the normal water level is held for biodiversity purposes in the top photo. But in a flood event, it will store an extra 600 cubic meters of water. And many of these interventions help downstream. So in principle, you may be familiar with graphs like this, where what we're trying to do is to avoid flood peaks. If you just think this nominally as the height of water at a particular point, and the blue line is the going above the green line, which is the flood level, that represents perhaps water going into people's houses and living rooms. If we can slow and spread out the flow of water, as in with the red line, then we may be able to attenuate flooding. And here's the kind of some modeling that was done earlier on to show any one of these interventions that I show we're doing will only have a tiny effect. But in principle, if you put in multiple interventions in series across the landscape, then working together, we hope, and the computer models show this, that this will alleviate flooding. So drilling down to my region, I'm tasked with looking at particular communities in the south of England which are prone to flooding. So I've been working for a year or two in deciding where and what to do, and what work to do, what's going to be most effective, what's going to be feasible and practical on the ground. So this is a report showing some of our partners, including the Environment Agency and the South East Rivers Trust, for example. The green area in this map is the area that my organisation covers. So it's, as I say, it's probably equivalent to a regional park in France. So it's a very heavily wooded and very hilly area to the south of London. It's got about 30% woodland cover, which is extraordinary for England. It's probably one of the most wooded areas in England. And that's ancient woodland with many small fields. And the top of the catchment is right in the centre of that. So we're working with the headwaters. So within that, there are a couple of sub-catchments that we've chosen to work on because we know there are small communities there, small villages, which regularly get flooded. And normal techniques of flood management are either too expensive and might help them. So this, for example, is a small village called Hellingley, which regularly gets flooded by a river in the background, which is the Bull River. And I've gone out, worked in that catchment and regularly helped out this lady. I came across her when she was flooded and helped her pump out her living room. So this is what we're trying to help. We're not trying to stop mega floods. We're trying to reduce the peak level of water in a flood by a matter of maybe 5-10 centimeters perhaps. But that's enough to make a difference to stop water coming into some people's houses. If we can achieve more, so much the better. But we're not trying to make huge difference to flood levels, just to knock the peak off. To help in the work and with the modeling, I use a software service called Scalgo, which is from a Danish organization, based in Aarhus. And I've put a link to their website, or if you can just remember Scalgo and Google that. Peter Bocker, who's my contact there, is on this call, and we'll tell you more about this. But it's a very good tool for modeling rainfall over terrain. It makes a landscape model, a terrain model using LiDAR. And then by pouring virtual rain on that, we'll explain where the rain goes and in what quantities. But the very clever thing about this is you can change the terrain. You can make interventions and then rerun the model in a matter of 30 seconds or a minute. And it will tell you what you've done, where the water will go, how much water you might be storing, for example. So it's very useful for that. It's also very useful for analysing catchments. So this is one of the sub-catchments that I'm working on. And the headwaters are in the top of a town called Heathfield. And they go and flood that town I've just showed you called Hellingley from this network of rivers. The red line, if I just trace a line down one of the river channels, and this is height above sea level on the left, and this is distance from the starting point. So we start off about 180 meters above sea level up here and get down to about 20 meters above sea level down at Hellingley, which is still quite a long way from the sea. But the remarkable thing about this graph is how steep that catchment is at the very beginning. So within the first, say, 2 kilometers, which is just up in this High Water area, the river is dropping almost half the height down to sea level. So it's very, very steep. Just to anticipate maybe the next one, but if we look at beavers, beavers would be living in these stretches. They're not living in the top parts because it's just too steep, and the water is very intermittent. It's a drought in the summer, and to make any dams to hold back this water is well, you don't hold very much in a single one. But anyway, this tool is very useful for doing this kind of analytics. It'll give you quantities of water upstream the catchment according to different water flows as well. You can also change the permeability of soils of it. So I find it a very useful tool. Now, to get on to the core of the subject, so leaky woody dams, here's a kind of an infographic explaining them in principle. So what we're trying to do is not build impermeable structures which permanently hold back water. What we want to do is to build structures which, in very heavy rainfall, will fill and hold back water just because of the sheer amount of it, but then gradually release that over a designed period, maybe a matter of a few hours or a day or a couple of days. And then that gradual release repeated up and down the system should help reduce the flood peaks downstream. We do take some inspiration from beavers. This is a beaver dam up on the River Tay in Scotland. And you can see they're working in lowlands here and making rather small dams out of not using massive timbers. And we do build dams like this, leaky woody dams. We have analog dams, if you like, high up in the catchments. Beavers have been extinct in the UK for, I don't know, probably 600 years. But they have been reintroduced into some areas in Scotland, and there have been wild releases in Devon. It's likely they'll be released all across the country, but the government is just deciding on the regulations for that. But in the meantime, we go on and replicate some of the things they do. But at the other end of the scale, we also do things like this. So this isn't typical of what we do. It's just shown as an extreme. We were working in a very steep, what we call a gill, a very steep woodland stream. And we had these pieces of timber that had been felled. They weren't extractable for other reasons. These are big oak timbers. So the contractors that I was working with just moved them down into the valley and into place to make a very, very large leaky woody dam. Now, of course, this is impractical. It was just an opportunistic thing because we had those timbers there. Our main principle is only to use timbers that are already available on site. We don't move timbers long distances, and we're not using timber that would be otherwise used for commercial purposes. But we do build we do use quite large timbers because of some research and a guide that was produced here. There's a link to this, which I recommend people look up. So in making our dam structures, there are a number of risks. One of which is that if the dams get washed away, then they could actually block culverts and cause flooding downstream, which would be us making the problem worse. So we look and assess how and where we're making things to try to avoid that. And this document summarizes the kind of risk assessment process and design process, really. So this, for example, then identifies some of the hazards. Probably the main one here is dams getting washed out or getting washed out in series. So there is a domino effect. One dam could break and then wash out the next one and so on. So they need to be built strong enough to withstand any flood you're likely to expect. And the big secret in this is to not to overextend and not to build anything on rivers which are just going to be too strong and powerful in a flood situation to cope with your leaky woody dams. In those areas, then perhaps standard engineering is more appropriate. But in smaller streams, headwater streams, if you use, and this is the key bit, using very long timbers, if you use long timbers, research has shown that even if they move, then they just jam up again very, very quickly. So if you can use timbers which are 2.5 times the width of the channel and somehow get them into the channel, if there's a big flood event, if they move, they don't move very far. I think there was research in North America where they tagged timbers of different lengths and exposed them to 5 years of flood events. And long timbers or branchy or irregular timbers, 2.5 times or more the width of the channel, effectively didn't move at all. They were functionally mobile. And other long timbers didn't move very much. So we try wherever possible to use long timbers when we're talking about our bigger structures. What this actually means in practice. So this is a structure we built a few years ago. And if you look at that tiny stream with just a trickle flowing underneath it in the summer, it looks like complete overkill. It looks like we've very much over-engineered that dam and we've used hugely long timbers. We've left the stumps of the trees that we've grown from for the trees to lodge against. And by various other means, we jam and work timbers in. So even in a flood event, they're held from moving. And even if they rise up, they're unlikely to rise over the tops of those stumps, for example. But in a medium-sized flood event, just a few months later, you can see that, you know, the purpose of them and the fact that they are starting to hold back water, even though that's a permeable structure, and maybe so not too much wood after all. And in a more major flood event, you can see that really that structure then is really serving its purpose and pulling back water further up the stream. So we're not interfering with fish passage in normal situations, but we are holding back water. What I'll go on to next is a recent project I've done. There's lots of text in it, but I'll just talk through some of the slides that show how I use Scalgo to design projects. So this is a project, you don't need to read or understand all of this water, but it's done on a smallish nature reserve, working with kind of willing owners in that catchment area I was showing to you earlier on. And this slide is just to show you that I do have to do quite lots of paperwork to go through the bureaucracy that's required to do anything in rivers. So even making these natural structures requires consent from local government or other authorities, depending on the size of the river. So I have to plan and explain what we're doing, and then, you know, decide whose liability is if there's something that goes wrong, which is the landowner in this case. So these are 3 aerial photographs of the same site. This is national mapping. So the blue square is a kilometre square. So you can see this is about 1 kilometre long, this woodland. It's well used by dog walkers, popular with the public. There are footpaths through it, but most of it is nature reserve. From aerial photography, you can get understand how it sits in the landscape, surrounded by small fields. But with the Scalgo LiDAR mapping, you can see the underlying structure and the deep streams that are running through it. The main channel going down through is probably too powerful for us to work on, so we'll avoid this. So what we're interested in are all of these side tributaries, which are more amenable to our work in terms of making leaky woody dams. So picking just one of these, this was some initial planning I did with building a series of leaky woody dams in the lower part of this tributary, plus some small ones in the kind of little feeder streams up at the top. Again, this is the same, only with the kind of contours on it. So the large contours are spaced 5 meters or so apart, or 2.5 meters apart. So it is fairly steep going down through here. The good thing with Skalgo, it will give you all of the kind of metrics around this, and you can change the amount of rainfall for a nominal event. The real use of Skalgo is that you can change the terrain. So if you can see here where this black line is, I've worked on that Skalgo model in a workspace, and I've built the equivalent of a meter-high leaky woody dam or a 0.8 meter high leaky woody dam. That's usually the size we build them. And by putting that in and changing the terrain, I can calculate the volume of water that would hold up if it was full to the brim. And in a very heavy rainfall event, we'd expect that to happen. So it gives us some idea, it's an estimate, of course, and a model, of how much water can be held according to the topography of the land. And I can calculate this and add them up. And I can also then record the information on the types of woody dams that we've built, and record metrics, and so people can go back and monitor them and check them. We're all part of a research effort, really, so it's important to do this. Having then done that, the next stage is to ground truth it and to check in practice whether this makes sense on the ground. And in heavily wooded, very scrubby landscapes, it's not always obvious that you can, what you do that. So you have to go in the winter when the vegetation's died back, and this is me with one of the contractors, and then agreeing the practical place in the ground where we can build these structures. And then we get to work. So in this case, we were felling ash timbers. Ash is a tree which is suffering from disease in the UK, so the trees were dying anyway. It's a frêne in French. And so we get to work, and we have some very good woodland contractors who understand the way our woodlands work and how to be able to move large timbers around in woodland without using heavy machinery. It's just impossible to bring heavy machinery into these sites, and we probably wouldn't want to do that anyway, because we'd have to cause a lot of destruction in the process. So everything that we've done here is with chainsaws. We use power winches, but otherwise it's just all hand tools. So just another view of the same thing. I allow my contractors to be creative because we are still at an experimentation stage. So we're building structures of a number of different designs to see which ones work, which ones last. One of the key things we do where possible is to incorporate species like willow, sol in French, or salix species, which will resprout from small stems and create natural dams to replace these as they rot out over time. These look closer together than they really are, but these are sort of series of different designs up through a valley. Another consideration is making how permeable you make the dams. And in the high headwaters, they need to be fairly impermeable to be able to hold water when there's not a lot of volume coming down at that level. As you go further down the catchment to the bigger streams, we make them more permeable, so they hold back less water in normal conditions, and there's less stress on them in a flood event. Here's another design, similar thing, and that's another one. There are actual willow bundles or willow fascines incorporated into that one to make it more permeable. And if those willow stems are alive, then they will regrow. And here are some examples of, this is only a few hundred yards away, the headwaters of that stream, and you can see the watercourse is much smaller. So it gives us an opportunity to make lots of small dams. And for those, very often we can work with local volunteers from the local communities to do those. As you can see, we build the dams in series, so they have a cumulative effect. This is a project we only put in March this year. I've got time-lapse cameras on these to monitor to see how well they work, but we need to wait for a flood event for that to happen. And another view of the same thing. One of the interests for me as an ecologist in doing a lot of this work is not just for flooding. I'm not particularly obsessed with flooding myself, but it does give opportunities for landscape restoration, for improving biodiversity. My contractors had some time over in this instance, so they put in a series of steps so the public have a defined way to walk so they don't cause damage by creating new footpaths all over the woodland. But there are also opportunities to create new wetland habitats and many others, and very often help farm businesses and that kind of thing. Back to the UK context, there's a link to this. Mine's now one of probably hundreds of small projects across the country. This is just a high level view of them in England. And you can see that, well, 4,500 individual projects and lots of water stored. There's lots of data being collected on this, which has been probably collected by our national rivers trusts and Environment Agency and partners. So we're still working to see how effective this is, but there was a lot of public support from it, especially from small communities. People like the idea of it. The government sponsored a national evaluation report, which was pretty positive about it. It's very hard to say with absolute scientific certainty that this works in all cases, but the kind of grey literature evidence, if you call it this, that, or evidence so far is quite encouraging. And on the end of this talk, these are links to some of the documents that I've given. I can put copies of these in the chat as well, which I'd recommend people look at. And if you go back into one of the earlier reports, many of the partner organisations, like the Rivers Trusts, for example, also have their own websites with a lot of their work on it, doing similar stuff across the country. And that's it from me.
Okay, thank you, Dean. I will take a lot of questions we have mainly in English. So first question, I'll go up, sorry. Alors, do you think there is a potential for leaky dams-like structures in low gradient catchments, small stream like the situation is in the Netherlands?
Yes, well, I think, yeah, I'm not sure about the Netherlands. But I mean, of course, the Netherlands has been in the advance of many places in making space for water, making room for water. So in a different situation, I think you could analyze the approach. I mean, most of the things I've talked about are looking at headwaters in my experience, but there are other probably similar approaches in terms of making space and diverting water and other things that can be applied in lowland catchments. Something I am working on slightly further down in the catchment where there are small floodplains. As I mentioned, beavers are probably going to be reintroduced to many areas of the UK, but by putting leaky woody dams into medium-sized rivers, if you like, or the kinds of rivers that beavers would be interested in damming, and combining them with perhaps bunds across floodplains, we can start to mimic beaver habitat. And also, if we're working with a number of landowners together, one of the things I didn't mention is that in my part of the world, there are many, many small landholdings. So to do anything without infecting neighbours is very often difficult. You have to get agreement of a number of people in an area. But if we work in advance of beaver reintroduction to get a number of landowners to work together to improve habitat and create similar habitats to beavers, If they are released, it's likely that they'll stay in those areas and take over, rather than going upstream and downstream and potentially causing problems in other places. And very importantly, we can get people ready for them. As I said, we haven't had them for 700 years. People have all sorts of misconceptions and misunderstandings. Beavers can sometimes cause problems. So if we can get people to welcome and get landscapes ready, then we can mimic that too. But perhaps I'm anticipating the next presentation.
Yes. You answer a part of the question of one of the people who ask you, how do you manage all the owner around the project? Do you face some people who are against? How do you do to convince them?
More people are in favour, very few against. I mean, one of the things with the leaky woody dams, we tended to be doing them in woodlands, which people have lost interest in. They're not using them for commercial activities. Very often they treat them as informal nature reserves. So it doesn't interfere with other people's activities. So that's why it's relatively easy. Most people are public spirited and they like the idea of helping their neighbours. If we can fund the work and do it all at no cost to them, that helps. And very often we try and combine this with other support for them and advice on other aspects of what they might want to do in woodland management or other areas, so they get some benefit from it too. But that is the big challenge for me. A lot of my work is diplomatically talking to landowners and bringing people on board. Very often water courses are also boundaries. So I have to work with landowners on both sides of a water course to get anything to happen. But that is the challenge. But as more people understand it, if we make demonstration projects like the one we've just seen and people can see it for themselves, then gradually we win them over.
Okay. And the question that some people are asking is, what about fish migration? Do you work in top of the river basin only, or you go further where it could be a problem with fish? How do you manage this question?
We're not building permanent structures. So in normal flow conditions, water flows underneath our dams. So we make a kind of a place for normal levels of water flow. It's only when there's a huge surge of water that the dams start to operate. I used to work for the Rivers Trust, who are very, very keen on fish and removing obstacles to fish migration. So I do understand that. I think in the other case, when we're working in the very, very tops of the catchments, probably 90% of the time, there's nothing more than a tiny trickle of water going through those areas anyway. So very unlikely that there'd be fish quite up that high. But it is something, it's a consideration and which we're very aware of, and we take that into account, yeah.
Do we have an idea of the real impact of the leaky woody dams on peak flow, or is it too early? Not enough flood peaks took place to say it?
There are other monitoring evaluation projects going on across the country. I've linked to that document I said, which was a national evaluation. And I think there are some researchers saying, well, yes, we can monitor that there's been a change of peak flow. Other ones are a bit more skeptical. The problem is it's very hard to do a scientific experiment when you don't have a control, because no two catchments are the same, no two rainfall events are the same. So it's tricky. If you model it, it suggests that it ought to work. We're collecting lots and lots of evidence as we go along to try and pull this together. One of the things I can say is when you have local communities doing this, and they've built lots of these, and they just go out in a rainfall event and see what these things are doing, they're persuaded by their own common sense, if you like, that this is a good thing to be doing and it's not causing any harm and it's probably helping. Yeah. So in a way, in terms of the normal route of scientists having to provide evidence to persuade politicians to do something, the politicians have to persuade the public. I think we have the public on our side already, persuading the politicians that we should be doing this stuff. But it is a challenge to do stuff with scientific certainty, which as I explained, this is still in its infancy, really.
Anyway, as flow defects, you can measure some biological effects, I suppose.
Yeah, we do ecological surveys before and afterwards, and we're kind of concerned about impacts on ecology. With lots of the other things, we can see improvements in some case. But there are lots of university-led projects which are working on this. I mean, as I said, I'm more of a practitioner, having to decide how, just to make it possible to do it in the first place, basically, and then we do long-term monitoring to see what the impacts are.
Okay. One question about how do you design your project with the slope of the field? I mean, is it like more or less on the field you decide?
Oh, well, yes. So that's why we use the Scalgo, because you can actually get some idea of that from the terrain maps, from the LiDAR. So it provides very, very accurate, fine detail contour maps. So if you say you'll build a dam here, it will tell you how far that will flood back and how much water it will hold. So that's the challenge. We have to build, if we're building steep areas, we have to try and pick good spots for them. So there is some kind of capacity to hold water behind them, and build a number in series. So as the steeper the slopes go, the closer they have to be together. And if you're in a lowland area, if we were working in the Netherlands, one big dam would flood half of the Netherlands, I suppose. So, but in a steeper area, not so much so.
A question about sedimentary continuity. We talked about fish, but what about sedimentary sediments? How did the mineral bed react to flooding? Mineral bed incision, bank erosion? Is it the aim about this erosion and incision? I mean, the change is done by the wood. So what is your aim about this question of sediment?
That's an interesting one. I think that what would be fine in a woodland environment, that behind the dams, you would find organic matter, twigs and leaves and branches building up, and creating a wetland area, hydromere, I think is the technical term, which creates its own habitat for various plants. But because these things are then very often dry in summer, those sediments are probably oxidizing, and they'll come to a stable condition. In some places, capturing sediment from runoff is seen as a desirable thing, especially when there are lots of sediments running downstream and polluting water supplies, because especially clay soils, they'll have phosphate particles and other things attached to them. So the water companies are very often interested in helping, doing what beavers would do elsewhere, and in capturing that fine sediment. I think it's something we're going to have to look at over time, but there will be an effect. And yes, definitely, it may be dynamic, but they'll be capturing, say, especially organic sediments.
This question will be also asked at the second presentation with the BDA. Just before to close your interview, I would ask something else. What are the maintenance requirements of this feature? Because how long do these structures typically last? Do they deteriorate or even rot away? And last question, who is responsible for maintaining them?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In some cases, there have been structures built which are almost like hard engineering, but with wood. So very artificial structures made like a log cabin, if you can imagine that. And if those start to wear out and break down, then obviously which they will do quickly in wet conditions, then they would need to be maintained and constantly replaced, which isn't a great idea. What we're trying to do is to kickstart natural processes. So perhaps with other debris falling in behind these dams, they will create natural structures. And if we plant willow into them, so trees which will grow very quickly in wet areas, we very often find natural bleaky woody dams which are made from fallen willow trees or fallen poplar trees, which are self-generating. They're living structures. Sometimes we deliberately fell trees, but with still a connection to its root, so the tree stays alive. If there's any possibility to do that, we always do that. So we're trying to kickstart natural processes and just basically rebuild them once and walk away and leave them. It could be that in the long term, you go back rather than trying to repair them. If one or two go, you go and make some new ones. And if it's part of your mainstream woodland management, then that's not such a difficult thing to do. But it's a good question. We're monitoring to find out, basically.
Anne?
Il y a pas mal de remarques dans le chat, parce que du côté français, on parle souvent de continuité écologique, d'effacement de
On the
seuil.
French side, they talk about ecological continuity and threshold effect. They're not like dams, you know, hard dams. So you allow water to flow through, and also you allow fish and sediments to seep through. So it's an interesting for French participants who often wonder how can they ensure the ecological continuity, which are of the which I installed as recommendation with the European Union, but you know, it seems to be. But the leaky dams, well, I mean, clearly those dams are quite leaky dams, which allow the water to and the sediments to flow through and the fish to climb up.
Yes, that's right. So in our landscape, you see the anvil. It was a big ironworking area, and almost all of these rivers had dams in them to drive water mills for ironworking. It was the center of the English iron industry back in the 16th and 17th century. So, and our arms manufacturing for making cannons to go to war with. I'm familiar with French landscapes. They're very often very similar. There would be ancient water mills. I've worked in the Doubs region down near Besançon. And it occurs to me that when all of these rivers had working mills and dams in them, they were probably providing some flood alleviation because there'd always be some spare capacity as the water was used up. So we're not trying to replicate that. We're trying to kind of allow the natural system to kind of progress, the natural flow of water, but in a big extreme flood event, then we're kind of temporarily holding back water to spill out more slowly. If anything, it ought to make it easier for fish to migrate because they're not going to get washed away downstream.
Okay, I will end with the last question because after we have to change our interview. The question is, you work about leaky dams, but is there any money available for moving people on infrastructure out of the floodplain and improving river crossing, by example, replace undersized culverts? Is it also a part of your management on your work?
Not part of my work, but we work with partners that do look at things like that. As I said in the early slides, we were working as part of the Frames project, looking at spatial reorganization of things. Very often building bigger culverts and better urban drainage systems and other things is all part of the solution. We're just a piece of the solution. As you can imagine, moving people out from houses built in the floodplain is very controversial. And sadly, in some parts of the UK, people still want to build in the floodplain, which is crazy. Yeah, so yeah, you can imagine that's not something people are happy about, but it may have to happen in some places.
Okay, thank you very much, Dean. Now we'll change and invite Stefan Bennett to join us. Stefan, are you here? Do you hear me? And if it's the case, please, could you share your screen with your presentation?
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep. It's working. Yes, we see your presentation. So I'll let you beginning. Just before you beginning, I just want to say that George Heritage couldn't reach us on Zoom because he had a technical problem. So we defer his presentation to last after the summer. So but it will be done again. So don't desperate, it will come. So now, please, Stefan, it's your time. We have at least 1 hour with questions.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and to give this presentation. And you shouldn't have told me I have an hour, because I can talk a lot. So my name's Stephen Bennett. I am a research scientist at Utah State University in Logan, Utah, in the USA. I also am a practitioner, and I really enjoyed Dean's talk. And I just want to preface my talk with saying Dean's talk basically covered all of the things that I do for a living, and all of the questions and Dean's answers are exactly the same questions and answers that I get in my work. So what Dean and I do are essentially the same thing, and I'm really excited to see that this kind of work is going on in Europe, just like it is here in North America. I have a little dig at the initial slide. So I've put a beaver over top of the excavator picture. You can see my cursor. And so the theme of my presentation is going to involve beaver, because they are the natural engineers that we need to help us initiate natural-based solutions. And so here's an outline of what I'll talk about. I'll basically describe what beaver dam analogs are. I'll talk about the kinds of things that they can do. I'll talk about how we build them. And then I'll provide some case studies to give you confidence that these methods are useful to repair rivers. And then I'll talk a little bit about the social conditions. And as I just mentioned, a lot of what I'm going to say should sound very familiar to Dean's talk. And then I have 2 links to websites here. We have written a manual on this, and it's freely available. We have hundreds of videos that you can go and watch, and other resources. And then, just like Dean showed, we're tracking projects across the United States and Canada. And this second link will take you to a bunch of projects that, if you're interested in seeing how other people are doing these things. So I know that in previous presentations that you've had in May, Dr. Joe Wheaton did some presentations on low-tech process-based restoration. And I work with Dr. Wheaton. And so for this talk, and just think of low-tech process-based restoration and nature-based as the same thing. They're coming at this restoration at the left-hand side of this continuum of different restoration actions that we could use to restore rivers. And so on the left-hand side here, we go from just basic changes in management. We don't necessarily have to do something active. It can be just stopping trapping beaver, or stopping, as Dean showed, excessive grazing could just all by itself lead to rivers recovering. And then this continuum goes through from that kind of management change to maybe relocating beaver, which is less expensive, to building simple nature-based structures like Dean was sort of showing, and what I'll talk about for the remainder of this talk, all the way over to these more active and more expensive engineering solutions. And at the bottom of this continuum, the way we sort of think of this is, on the left-hand side, we're trying to let the system do most of the work for us. So we're using management changes or beaver and structure or wood to and the power of water to do the work, versus over on this end of the continuum, we're using excavators and heavy machinery and engineering to try and restore rivers. And it's not that any one of these types of approaches is good or bad all by itself. I think we need, as Dean mentioned, all sorts of different tools to help us restore rivers, but our group focuses on this low-tech, nature-based approach. And as Joe talked in, Dr. Joe Wheaton talked in May, we have a set of principles. It sounds like Dean uses a set of principles too when he's implementing these kind of activities. And what we're talking about today is adding structure to rivers. And the reason we do that is because of this simple principle that when you put structure in a river, it creates complexity and resilience. And it kicks off this simple cascade of where the adding of structure changes the flow. The change in flow leads to some geomorphic changes, sorting of sediment, connection to the floodplain. And these changes in geomorphology and hydrology lead to this complex riverscape, which is healthier, more resilient, and can also give you the added benefit of flood protection, as was just discussed. Other principles that we use when we're implementing this nature-based restoration, low tech, is that we need space. It's very difficult to restore a river if it doesn't have some kind of access to its historic floodplain. And so this kind of restoration becomes much more challenging if you can't connect to the floodplain. However, if only 50% of the floodplain is available, that might still be enough that you can do some work. And then, unlike engineering approaches, when we're adding structure, we're trying to let the river make some decisions for us. And so we don't over-engineer these structures. We often build them by hand and use simple methods and most of the work's done by hand, and we're not trying to make these structures permanent. And as Dean mentioned, although we're trying to slow the water down and pond water, the structures are still permeable. They're not like building concrete dams. And as was discussed in the last talk with the questions, the ultimate goal is sustainable, healthy riverscapes. So we expect to have to go back and do maintenance on these structures if beaver are not doing the maintenance for us. And that was discussed in the previous presentation. And so when we design these projects, we are explicitly thinking about going back, monitoring the project, and as needed, doing maintenance. Okay, so the main focus of my talk is to talk about these magical structures called beaver dam analogs. I'll use the acronym BDA to refer to beaver dam analogs. The reason we build those is we are trying to mimic beaver and the natural processes that beaver create. This is a natural beaver dam. This is a lodge where the beaver would be living, and this is the large pond. The water's flowing from upstream to downstream here. This dam is about 30 meters long and about 2 meters high, just to give you an idea of the size of some of the beaver dams. And this is right in a local river close to where I work. And so if we're going to try to mimic what beavers do, then we should understand a little bit about natural beaver dams. So why do beavers build dams? Well, they build dams for their own protection. The pond that's created by building the dam gives them refuge from predators, and maybe not so much in Europe, but here in North America, we still have lots of predators, cougars and bears, coyotes and wolves, and they all like to eat beavers. So that's one of the reasons beavers build dams. They also build dams because it gives them more access to the hill slopes and to vegetation that they eat and or need to build the dams. And they also collect a lot of this material and store it in the dam so that in the wintertime, when the pond freezes over, they have a food source underneath the ice. And the lodge that they have actually has an underwater entrance. So they can live all winter in their lodge and just go under the ice and collect the food that they stored all summer. So that's why beavers build dams. How do they do this? Well, very generally, they sort of build two different types of dams. They build what we refer to as primary dams. So these large dams that I just showed you, they're often quite high, 1.5 to 2 meters high or more. And that's where they have their lodge. And so that's their central location that the population and the family of beavers operate out of, this primary area. And then they build a series of secondary dams, and that is to provide deeper water so that they can move upstream and downstream, collecting food and throughout the year. And it's also thought that they build these secondary dams below a primary because it backs up water to the base of the primary dam. And as water comes over the primary dam, it has less of a distance to fall, and therefore it reduces the likelihood that the primary dam will get scoured out by flow. And so it protects the primary dam from failing. And then they build these things called what we call mattresses. So they lay lots and lots of sticks on the backside of the dam. And again, we think that is sort of a way of beaver dealing with hydrology. And so again, as the water comes over the dam, all these sticks break the flow up, and that again reduces stream power and minimizes the likelihood that the primary dam will get scoured out and fail. And then beavers use what is ever available on the local landscape, lots of mud, lots of sod, so grass and mud, lots of rocks. Maybe people don't think beaver use rocks, but you can see a bunch of fairly good-sized cobbles up on the front of the dam. So these beavers actually carry rocks and put them on the face of the dam, and then lots of sticks and logs. So they're a big matrix of material. That's how they build dams. And I stress this, here's a picture of a beaver dam that has been breached. So the flow is now going through the dam. The dam has failed on this one end. And so you can see the architecture of the dam. And what I'm using with this red arrow here is to draw your attention to just a huge amount of mud and dirt that is on the front face of the dam. So the water is flowing from left to right. And they excavate mud from the upstream side of the dam and then plaster it onto the dam. And that helps plug holes and make the dam less impermeable, not completely impermeable, but less impermeable. And so it ponds water better. And then the thing that beaver do as well is lots of maintenance. And so they're constantly working on their dam and patching the dam. And this just goes into what we've talked about already, which is this kind of low-tech, nature-based restoration requires maintenance, and it requires going back and monitoring, and it's not a one and done kind of restoration, as we like to say. Okay, so just to sum up, and I know probably most of you know this already, but I just want to kind of get a set in the, what do beavers and beaver dam building, why are we so interested in mimicking this? Well, it's because it makes healthy ecosystems in general. And if we want to be more specific, natural beaver dams increase the complexity of the stream by changing or increasing the variability in water depth, velocities, flow velocities, the width of the channel, and just slowing and storing some of the high flows. They also create all sorts of geomorphic units like building bars and grading the channel and scouring pools. And then what a lot of people are really interested in is this thing we call connectivity. So here you can see this is a BDA, but it could also be a natural beaver dam, and it's forcing water out. There's another BDA up here. And this connectivity is not only slowing water down during high flows, but it's also recharging groundwater. And unlike Dean, where some of the primary reasons he's building structures is to attenuate flow, we're interested in doing that too. But I work in the Western United States, where we're more interested and focused on drought. And lots of rivers are starting to have lower base flows. And so by storing water in connecting the floodplain and then having the groundwater recharged, we're hoping that we could actually increase or extend the length of time that streams flow during the summer. And then sort of the overall benefit of beaver dams and mimicking beaver dams is this: it will increase the extent of the riparian area and also the function. And so when rivers are disconnected, we tend to get non-riparian species invading into the floodplain. And they're not as productive as if the riparian area was healthy and had riparian species. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about beaver dam analogs specifically, now that we've kind of talked about the benefits of natural beaver dams and why we're trying to mimic them. And just a little anecdote, how did we develop this BDA or beaver dam analog approach? Well, back in about 2009, we were starting a long-term experiment where we were trying to increase fish populations by restoring the stream. And we noticed that on the left here, there were beaver present, and they were building dams in an incised channel. And every year that there was high flow in the spring, the beaver dams would blow out. So almost 95% of the beaver dams would blow out because all that stream power was limited to flowing in this incised channel. And so the researchers got the idea that they could reinforce the beaver dams. And so they drove untreated wooden fence posts into the beaver dams, and that helped those beaver dams persist the high flow events. And so then they thought, well, we could just start building our own beaver dams. And so that's where the idea of beaver dam analogs began. And then the researchers began to study the effect of this on both habitat and fish. And that started in 2009, as I mentioned, and it's still ongoing. And there's been many papers published, and I'll be happy to send those around. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about just how we build them. I saw in the introduction to this symposium that there are lots of practitioners participating. And so I'm guessing you want to know how to build these.
Just, Stefan, you have at least half time passed, so please, we are trying to finish in 15-20 minutes to have time for question.
Okay, will do. So there's two types of beaver dams analogs that I'm going to talk about. Version 1, so when the first type that we developed we call them post-line wicker weaves, and lots of people are building these all over North America. I'll also talk about a second version, and they're just a more natural looking and built style of building. So I'll go through those fairly quickly. The goal in many cases is just to get water out on the floodplain and pond water. And so here's a pine tree growing. This is not a riparian species. And so and over here, this is sagebrush. This is also not a riparian species. And so by building these structures, we're trying to get that natural riparian vegetation growing again, and also benefit fish. So here we are about to start building. So the first thing we do is drive posts into the ground using a hydraulic post pounder. And in bigger rivers, we put that post pounder in a small boat and float it down the river. And then we weave material. That's why it's called a post line wicker weave. We weave the material between the posts. And here's a picture at higher flows after we built this structure. And you can see we're now pushing water out onto the floodplain, achieving that initial goal. Here's just a picture looking at that weave from the downstream side without a mattress on there, so that you can just see how we weave. We use all sorts of different material. And just like Dean said, our goal is always to use the material that is already there. It keeps the cost down, and it's just more efficient to use material that is already on site if you can. And then, as I mentioned, we add lots and lots of dirt, because that's what beaver do. So we dig and add buckets of dirt. And so here's a little schematic. The flow is coming from left to right, and we add dirt to the front end of the structure. We weave the material through. You can have one line of posts, or you can have multiple lines of posts, and then we add a mattress on the back. The important thing to take away from this is that this wicker weave is a fast and fairly efficient and effective way to build and mimic a beaver dam, but by its very nature, it tends to not be very wide. And so the width of this is because you're weaving around the posts, it's less than 1 meter wide. And just like Dean talked about, the strength of this method is really not in any one structure, but it's in building multiple structures and having large extents on your project, so multiple kilometers. That's when you're going to see the benefits to the ecosystem, not by just building, 1 or 2 of these. Now, the more natural one, the takeaway is it's built more like a beaver dam. It's much wider at the base, and it's more of a triangular shape. It basically means it's a bit less permeable. The water has to fight to get through this dam more than the narrower dam of a wicker weave. Here's just a picture. They look more natural than the wicker weave. And, here's the dirt going all the way out to the well out in front. And then the extent of the base of this structure is all the way back to the bottom of this mattress that I mentioned before. If you can pick a location where the bed is raised a little bit, it just means you need less material when you're building your structure. So that's just a little tip on site selection. But the way we build these more natural looking BDAs is lay the material down parallel to the flow, and then sort of use a matrix of material for that first layer. And then we add lots of rocks and dirt and sod and sediment and pack that down. Here's just a picture of that, buckets again. And then we just keep building it in layers like a lasagna. And then when we get to the desired crest elevation, we put a mattress on the back of it. And again, this is just a much wider and more robust structure. And then we add posts afterwards. And we do that because it forces a better habit of building a more natural structure by putting the posts in after rather than putting them in ahead of time. And we can do all sorts of things like connect to side channels. So here we are forcing water out of the main channel and into a historic side channel. Here's a downstream view of a big natural looking BDA. And this is more like a secondary BDA that's backing water up to the base. And then we get lots of questions about things like how do we orientate the structures? Most of the time we're just building them straight across the structure, across the channel, perpendicular, but you can follow the natural contours of the river. We generally avoid building concave dams because that tends to concentrate flow in the center. And we get lots of questions about how many posts should we put in and what sort of orientation of the posts. And really the bottom line is it doesn't matter as long as you have enough posts to make the structure fairly resistant to flow and not wash out. Now, the maybe more interesting part is some of the case studies. So here's a case study where people use this method in an incised channel. You can see how incised it is. It's over 2 meters in size. They built these wicker weave BDA. They had a high flow and they got over 1.5 meters of aggradation the first year. So these structures can catch a lot of sediment and help you treat this incised condition. I just want to mention, I'm not going to talk about this, but we make leaky dams too. We call them post-assisted log structures, or PALS for short. And they're just a little bit messier and a little bit more trying to simulate or mimic natural log jams. So they're similar to what Dean presented, but messier. And then we build them in different varieties. So some are bank attached, and that can help widen the channel, which is one of the processes needed to start incision recovery sometimes. And then all of these different types of PALs just help to increase complexity in the stream and benefit fish. Here's another example of us using BDAs. This was in Bridge Creek, Oregon, where BDAs were developed. They built 100 BDAs, and then beaver moved into the area, built 260 more dams, and we documented a meter or more of aggradation behind the structures. We documented a meter increase in the water table in the floodplain, and then we documented lots of floodplain connection. But what really got people excited, and this is, we do a lot of work to try and increase fish populations. And this is for an endangered steelhead population. We got 172% increase in production. And this is an experiment. And as Dean mentioned, it's hard to do studies. We spent $500,000 a year for over 15 years doing this experiment with treatment and controls, watersheds. And so this is very hard to do, very expensive, but people wanted to know if this worked. And so we spent a lot of money to demonstrate that it did work. And finally, one other case study. This is a local rancher. We have the same situation, lots of private land ownership, and there's lots of private landowners wanting to do this kind of work now. This landowner tried to relocate beaver by himself, and they were unsuccessful. And we think it's because the stream was very shallow and it sometimes went dry. And so he met Joe Wheaton, Dr. Joe Wheaton. This is Joe here. And we built the rancher some BDAs and then released beaver into this deeper water habitat. And the result was the beaver managed to stay there this time and survive. And they've now built over 200 dams. This was the original thin, narrow channel. And now that we have floodplain connection. And we also saw a fish increase here as well. And I'll wrap up with just the social considerations. They're all the same kind of things that Dean talked about. Obviously, there is risk when we build these kind of structures. I personally think the risk is over exaggerated many times. So we've built lots of structures close to houses, but here these houses are several meters above the stream. They're out of the floodplain. There's no real risk to doing restoration here. And just as another example, we're working with the Mile High Flood District in Denver, Colorado. There's over almost 3 million people live in this watershed, and they're actively managing and trying to live with beaver. And so if 3 million people can write a management plan to live with beaver, I'm sure we can do this kind of restoration in other places. And this is just based on an adaptive management framework where you identify whether areas are low, medium, or high risk, and you have specific management actions ready to apply if there's problems. So, we can manage these things, but yes, risk is potential. And then I just want to end saying, again, a lot of the same things I heard Dean say. Lots and lots and lots of people want to do this kind of nature-based restoration, and they've been excluded historically from stream restoration. Has been the venue of engineers up until this point. We've taught dozens and dozens of workshops to thousands of people, and it's pretty obvious that people want to participate in stream restoration, and these kind of low-tech, nature-based, hand-built approaches are intuitive and expand the number of people that can work and restore rivers. So let's do this, and yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We have a lot of questions in French, so I will let Anne taking this question. And just before Anne asks question, could you confirm me, Anne, that you can reach Dean as a panelist because he was excluded? Anne, are you with us? Okay.
Eh bien, je le vois pas dans ma liste de spectateurs.
Okay. So he can hear. Let's try to begin with questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe
Il y avait des questions plutôt d'un point de vue écologique.
Maybe we could stop
so the
sharing your
questions are
screen.
ecologic.
Maybe you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. I let you.
Il y avait des questions sur les aspects.
There were questions on the ecological side of things. Does this bring in new species of beavers in these different BDAs? Does it attract different species of beavers?
Well, so the question is about different species of beaver. We only have one species of beaver in North America, Castor canadensis. So it attracts those beaver, okay. And I can't imagine that it wouldn't attract beaver in Europe as well. They are basically the same, similar activities, ecological activities.
Okay.
And if you notice,
est-ce que les barrages de castors constituent des obstacles au franchissement des poissons?
So are beaver dams an obstacle for fish?
Yeah, this is a question that we get every time we present. And the answer generally is no. In North America, fish have adapted evolutionarily to beavers and beaver dams, and so they've coexisted for 10,000 years. I could see this being slightly different in Europe, where beaver have been extirpated for half a millennia. But as Dean showed, at high flow, water is going around and over these structures, and fish are very well adapted to moving during high flow conditions. Fish can also jump. The steelhead that I mentioned, they can jump over 2 meters high. So I do not consider these fish barriers, but you should monitor your own system to convince yourself that that is true.
Anne, we lost you. No sound, Anne.
Est-ce que vous avez dit que ces
You
barrages...
said that these dams encourage the replenishment of groundwater when there's no water. Does this not act also on heating of water and the quality of the water?
That might be the second most common question we get about beaver dams. And so we have a paper that we published, and the answer is beaver dams increase the variability of temperature, not the overall temperature. And so what happens is they force, through hydraulic head, they force water into the groundwater, and then that water re-enters the stream in different locations, and it comes out at different temperatures. And so the pond water might warm up, but other water entering the stream will be cooler. And so the overall effect is variable water temperatures across the riverscape. And so fish are, again, very well adapted. If they want to find warm water, they can find warm water. If they want to find cooler water, they can find cooler water because it's variable. And I can provide these papers in the chat as well.
Il y a une autre question autour de l'effet barrage.
There's another question on the dam effect and the sediment. Won't there be, can't there be a sudden release of sediment from the dam at any point?
Yes. So if these structures can capture sediment, and they will fail sometimes, just like natural beaver dams. But my answer is sort of the same as Dean's answer, which is if you build hundreds of these structures, then when one or two fail, that material is caught downstream in other structures. And so there's a dynamic sort of effect here. And so we use a principle we call strength in numbers. The strength of this approach is building multiple structures.
Les gens échangent beaucoup dans les messages.
So people are chatting a lot in the chat. So I'm just looking for the next question. You said that with these BDAs, the fish population is increasing. Are they the same types of population? Because the water dynamics is different, do the species change?
That's a good question. the dominant species is still steelhead, but you can have different species. We have invasive fish species in some of our rivers, like I'm sure you have in Europe as well. So the answer is the population of fish could change, but in natural settings, it's the same population. It's just the number and the different life stages of fish tend to use different parts of the riverscape. So maybe the adult fish live in the ponds more and the smaller fish live in off-channel habitat. So there's a partitioning of life stages of the same species when you make more complex habitat. I'm happy to, for the organizers to share.
Il faut beaucoup de place en fait pour mettre en place.
You need a lot of space to organize this dam. So this is my comment. So there must be a floodplain close by, which is large enough as well and long enough as well. Antoine, do you see any other questions?
Yeah, these kind of techniques work best when you have access to the floodplain. If there are people living on the banks and in the floodplain, this approach is going to be less useful. We have some evidence that if you're building small structures and not trying to flood the floodplain and just increasing the complexity of the channel, there are some benefits, but the greater benefits of these approaches and all restoration comes from when you can give river the space it needs to be a natural river.
In this matter of the floodplain reconnection, I would ask you if there is any potential unexpected consequences in any of your sites. How did you manage specific adaptative measures, like with, by example, farmers or something else like that?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that we stress these hand-built approaches. Is it doesn't take very long to build these structures. We can build 5 or 10 structures a day with a crew of 4 or 5. So that means if they start to cause problems, we can unbuild them very quickly too. We can just take them apart, we can remove them. We haven't had too many cases where we've needed to do that, but that is one of the strengths of this approach, I guess, is they can be removed if people don't want them. And I would, I guess, just stress, you can avoid a lot of this, and Dean did a good job of sort of describing planning, right? You're meeting with landowners, you're meeting with funders, you're identifying risk well ahead of time. So in theory, you don't try to do this where the local community isn't on board, and that you have their trust that you will deal with problems if they occur.
Another question, I don't think you already answered it, but how can BDAs mitigate drought? I would have thought it would increase evaporation.
This is a complicated question, and it's one of the harder things to study. Not only evapotranspiration, but just transpiration by trees and vegetation. Many people think that the more vegetation in the floodplain, the less water you'll have because the plants are transpiring water into the sky. In this example I showed you, where the rancher introduced beaver, and then those beaver built 200 dams I may have forgot to mention, he documented that stream going dry every year in June. And after the beaver moved in, the stream kept running all year round. And so this is where models and nature sort of have a tension. People have tried to model how beaver dams could extend flow, and it doesn't look like they could if you just model it. But we have a natural documented case where they did extend summer flow. And it's because the groundwater dynamics are so complex, it's very hard to model those. So maybe in some places we can extend base flows, maybe in other cases we can't. But we have demonstrated in this one particular case that the flows were extended with multiple dams. And we took into account the precipitation and snowpack effect on the hydrology pre and post beavers. So we're relatively confident that they did actually increase base flow. But it is extremely difficult to study.
Okay. I have 3 questions in one.
Il y a des questions autour de ces opérations de ces barrages.
There is a question about the dams that make it possible to restore the river or the stream, because they create different habitats. So is it a restoration operation per se?
I'm not quite sure what the question is. Could you rephrase it?
Il y a des dans les participants là, il y a des gens qui se demandent.
Among the participants, some people wonder if such dams are just there for amenities of development or as restoration of the river as such. There are discussions about that. You restore biodiversity or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, at the onset, Dean and I both agree what we're trying to do is reestablish natural processes. And those natural processes are beaver themselves and the dams they build and the wood that is brought into the stream by beavers or by natural processes of forest succession and trees falling in. And so these approaches are ultimately to restore natural processes and ecosystem function and resilience. That is the goal. Rivers are broken all over the world, and it's because we took beavers out in many cases and we reduced the amount of wood in streams. And so we're trying to do the exact opposite. Put that stuff back in and let it heal the river.
Okay. Pour construire ces barrages-là, vous avez des besoins d'autorisation administrative.
So I suppose you need also authorization from local authorities? Yes. Is there sort of a regulation or regulations?
It's just like Dean mentioned, we need lots of permits and we have lots of paperwork and bureaucracy. However, because we've been teaching workshops to federal agencies and land managers, the permitting for this type of work has become relatively easy. But we need permits. And our biggest issue in North America, and especially the Western United States, is that here landowners have water rights, and those water rights are above the ecosystem's right to have water. So the landowner can take water, all of the water, if in some cases. And so that's one of the biggest problems we're facing right now is we need the water to do the work for us, to help us. And the landowners, so we need the landowners to support this.
Antoine, vois-tu d'autres questions?
Antoine, any other questions?
Yes. I have three questions in one. Is you talked about reinforced dams, beaver dams with posts, for example. So it's quite like to do in an artificial way to strengthen them. So people say why we should put this this post in this beaver dam if they move after flood. It's natural, and in consequence, I have something else to add is we have so not so much free flow rivers. So is it something like a good idea to put another dams? And the last question, which is not exactly in the same topic, but quite near, is what about rivers which are with constraints outside, like urbanization or something like that? Do you have made some beaver dam analog in some urban area or something else like that?
Yeah, so first question, the reinforcing of a beaver dam was because the beaver dam was in an incised channel. And incision is a common degradation of rivers where we work. So the river has cut down and now it's trapped. The water can never get out on the floodplain, and that's why we have upland vegetation now encroaching on those floodplains, is because water never gets out on the floodplain. So that's the only reason we would reinforce a natural beaver dam, is that the natural beaver dam is blowing out, failing more often because of that incised situation. And we're speeding up recovery, right? That incision is a natural process. The problem is that it's happened to most rivers almost everywhere. And so we're trying to speed up natural recovery. And I can't remember the other two parts of that question. The last one is, which was, can we do this in urban areas? And the answer is yes. We just have to plan and communicate with the locals. There is more risk, but that risk can be mediated. And for example, we had a beaver build a dam on the edge of a Walmart parking lot. Walmart is a big superstore in the US. And so if Walmart can tolerate beaver dams in their parking lot, then that tells you that you have some hope of working in urban areas.
The second part of the question is that we have not so much free flow rivers. So why to put another dams?
I don't know. What do you mean by free flow? Do you mean they have dams on them, or they don't run very often? They don't have a lot of water?
I would say maybe it's a little of the both, but is they say also because of ecosystem of free flow rivers, they are not so much developed. So maybe to ensure new dams could be something with some difficulties for this ecosystem.
Yeah, that's always another problem with restoration. If we don't have access to the floodplain, or if somebody is diverting water or storing water upstream, or those kind of things just make restoring natural processes harder. But even if we only restore natural processes to 50% of what they used to be, that's better than nothing, I guess. So.
And to complete, what would be your criteria to build a beaver dam analog? Which space are better than the other, by example? And is it applying? Could you applying it in the karst rivers? I don't know if you mean what I mean by karstic river. Yep.
Okay, I'll deal with the last part of that question first, because it's a good one. So there's many different rivers out there, lots of different geologies. The simple answer is if beaver were there historically, then you can build beaver dams there historically because there's a historical precedence. And it's the same with wood. If wood was a natural part of that river, it doesn't matter what geology is, it doesn't matter what the flow is, these approaches are appropriate. My one caveat is, just like Dean said, these approaches are most suitable in smaller to medium-sized rivers, and we call those order 1 to 5, stream order 1 to 5 streams, and that would encompass stream flows of like less than a cubic meter per second to maybe as much as 30 or more cubic meters per second. We have built these structures in. So a large, that's including high flows.
By consequence of beaver coming back, if we help them to come back, it could be problem with culture farmers, but also forest. I mean, they could cut trees, and also in some place we can see that there is no willow, no brush, so they cut trees with a pear or whatever. How do you manage? Do you plant with at the same time, or just do let do nature?
Yeah, so beaver cut down trees. They eat trees, and that's what they do. If you have trees that you don't want them to cut down, we fence them. We put fences around a cage to prevent them from eating the trees. And yes, it's a catch-22, if that's a phrase that you're familiar with. By putting water on the floodplain, you can grow more trees, but beaver will eat trees. And so, yes, we do planting as well. But you have to, again, part of the natural process is beaver eating trees. So if you're not comfortable with beaver eating trees, then that can be a problem.
Question about participation. Do you feel that sometimes it's coming from stakeholders, some of, people in the cities, or it's much more the fact that you create these things and do animation that it's coming back after? What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, that's okay. That's a good question. So it's both. Beaver awareness and just stream restoration in general. More and more people are interested in restoring the natural environment. So that would be farmers and city people, both care about the environment. What we've noticed is because of drought, ranchers and farmers in the Western United States especially realize the benefits of beaver all by themselves. We didn't have to tell them that. That one rancher that I told you about, he tried to reintroduce beaver himself because he understood that by holding back the water, you could get low flow summer benefits. His cattle can drink out of the beaver ponds, etc. So we are seeing both agricultural people being interested in this and city people. It's not one or the other, it's both.
The last question, because we have to finish. You have 2 minutes to summarize. Is the river itself considered by the stakeholders as a being with its own rights, with the same rights as the landowners nearby?
Yeah.
It's a philosophic.
Yeah, well, I consider that, yes, but I don't think the general public does yet. But that, I actually think, is a goal that we should have as a restoration community, that the local community takes ownership of their river and gives it the right to be healthy. Yeah, and I see that is possible. I see people care enough, but it's going to take a long time and it is hard. But I'm somewhat hopeful.
Okay, we will now close the debates. Thank you very much for coming with us, Stephen, to explain all this stuff. As we could say that we will not finish with this subject because we plan to speak about beavers after summer, and also with George Heritage, who couldn't present his stage 0 restoration concept. So I invite people to note in the chat between 1 to 5 I would appreciate. 1 is what, oh no, I was, it's not interesting. On 5, oh yes, it's really interesting. I want to do something like that. So just to have like a survey. And now I'd let Anne to conclude this seminar.
Voilà. Mais écoutez, merci.
Well, thank you very much to the two speakers for their brilliant presentation. Thank you to the participants who asked some very good questions and who made it possible to have a different view and explore the complexity of the diversity of these of ecological engineering based on natural practices or mimicking nature, nature-based solutions presented by Dean as well, taking, of course, well, to get leaky dams, called different techniques. We use nature as an ally, and therefore there are discussions good is these works which are we structure the river, which should allow fish sediments to flow or to try to circulate, and well, we try to reconcile the floods, mitigation of floods, biodiversity, and so on and so forth, and the healthy water rivers. So, sorry, Dean Morrison could not put you back as a panelist. My apologies. Indeed, Antoine, I want to thank Genius River TV and ICRR for their partnership in this webinar. And you will find George and Heritage in a subsequent webinar organized by Antoine and River TV in September. Nothing is lost. All this has been recorded anyway, in French and in English. We'll set the videos. We'll get them on the channel of the Great. Thank you all. Thank you all for your participation, and talk to you next week for those who will attend the last webinar, which will deal with global warming of rivers and impact on climate change, what impact on the hydrosystems and the management. So between two I.S.Rivers conferences we can discuss. Thank you all. Thank you to the partners who make it possible to do this. Good evening, and see you soon. See you next week.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Great. Thank you, AS-River. Thank you, Earth Air.